The B-side has now been named. It's called Flashpoint, and a very apt point was made on Twitter recently that I just saw, which is that it's similar to the comics where everything was kind of turned all over its head. Was there any inspiration for the name in there?
You mean from the DC comics? No, that was actually just purely coincidental. Like we literally had marketing people who tried to come up with different concepts. I would just say it's more along the lines of luckily thematically it ties with what we're trying to do in esports. You should make a flashpoint of bringing together all this different talent. We've even got talent from other games obviously coming over. And in terms of the product we're trying to make, it's bringing together different concepts. Like we're taking ideas from Korean Brood War, we're taking ideas from American traditional sports, even things that borderline other even sports, like fighting each other professionally, some of the attitude from that. We're putting it all in one place, and then luckily for us, there are these things called flashbangs in the game, which do catch your attention. We were able to tie it all together. Some of that was coincidental, I will say, but I'll spin the story now as though, it was all just a merging of the worlds.
I think that's the benefit of being the esports historian. You kind of get to write some of the history as well all along the way. But a very straightforward question about some of the semantics of something that was slightly controversial about the $100,000 fine that was discussed for teams, which is that are teams going to have a grace period at any point? So, for example, if a team just had a roster change and you kind of want to see how the roster is going to settle in, will it be top 20? Or, for example, if the team just fell out of top 20, how is that going to work?
To my knowledge, no. What's funny is when people, as you said, imply it's controversial, right? What they're worried about is but won't it be unfair that people have to pay the money? No, I don't think it's unfair, actually, that if you are the 30th best team in the world and you want to stay in a team in a league where people are buying in for millions and putting their literally millions of dollars hard-earned money into the league, that you can just mess around and do what the Shanghai Dragons did in Overwatch League and lose 42 games in a row and then say, can I still have my share of the profit? No. That seems unreasonable to me. That's why I even said, I noticed it was almost like a trick question when people wanted to know, what if a team wins the league though? We've been magnanimous enough to still let teams who don't buy in come to the table, eat from the dinner that we've all cooked, made and provided, and then they're like, but if they do well, shouldn't it be their dinner table next time? Well, yeah, you provide the dinner and we'll all come to yours. So my premise is, I think it's pretty magnanimous to let you come along and win the money and qualify without paying the $2 million, then beat us all, if you indeed can. I'd love to see that story. If you're good enough, I like to see the best teams play, obviously. But the premise is, if you then want to make some of the revenue share as well as that prize money, right, well, come and be our partner then. Pony up the $2 million, get the running costs, make sure you can pay that $100,000 fine every month, because the premise isn't to give people respite. The premise is, if your team isn't top 20, well, you can either pay us all for the pleasure of being part of our league with a garbage team, or you can go out there and buy players where, as I alluded to, little spoiler in case anyone couldn't figure it out, I was talking about Cold Zero being sold from MIBR. That costs you less to buy Cold Zero than it does to pay a year's worth of the fines. So just do the mathematics, and there's going to be a lot of people in the current ecosystem who aren't going to want to pay millions extra. They're going to level up their teams, which is the entire premise of it. The premise is to find people who do badly, to make them, to incentivize them at least, to level their game up, because actually if they can't hang, this ain't the league for you then, mate. So the people who are coming in now, that's why it's not going to be a fly-by-night league. They know that this is a serious commitment they're making, and it even includes, I think it's quite brave, the fact that even the people who formed the league, those teams, some of those teams, if you asked me to predict, I'd guess a couple of them are going to be paying some fines, and they're going to be paying it to their, in other parts of esports, direct rivals. They're going to be paying that guy money because they made a bad decision. So I have to say, as a CS fan, I'm greedy. I love the fact that this means now if your general manager's rubbish, you better fire him and hire someone who knows a lot about the game. If your coach isn't good enough for these new players, you better get a better coach. And of course, if your players aren't good enough, you better go and get the best players. Then we'll talk.
Basically, Thorin's finding more ways to give Maui job opportunities, is what he's saying. But the other thing that I was slightly curious about is that you mentioned also that you're taking some things from the NFL, from traditional sports, and again, very straightforward question, which is that, are we going to say non-game broadcast days as well be a part of this overall league? So, for example, where we do sometimes see shoulder content that'll last an hour, where analysts can do whatever they want, etc., etc., when it isn't really corresponding with the game. So that's something that the Blasters recently tried experimenting with a little bit as well. Are we going to see something like that from you guys?
My premise isn't that it wouldn't correspond with the game. I would consider, for example, doing a documentary about players who are legendary players to be still part of the game. It's their career within the game. So I don't have a plan to, I personally think it's whack doing all that, crazy content where they're, throwing pies and these. I even said when they used to do that stuff to Moses and the rest of them, can you get above this pantomime level? This isn't esports. You might think this is fun because you're getting to show your personality, but why don't we do that with the game? Why don't we argue about who the best teams are? So as far as I know, it isn't planned that it'll be broadcast but not on a game day. But the premise is that the broadcast itself will be more extended than anything you've seen before in terms of an individual match, and there will be shoulder content around that. So you can think of things like Road to a Super Bowl or a Stanley Cup type productions. You can think about discussions of the analysts among who the best teams are, what the meta is. And for me, I hope personally that the way we will make it so that you watch when it's not the game day is that we'll be bleed over into the socials, into the YouTube channels, the Twitch channels and whatnot. And the idea is there will be shoulder content that goes there. Because another thing that people often miss is when I follow the NFL and I follow the UFC, I don't really watch when the game or the fight's on. Half of it's watching to build the hype for it or to set the storylines up, or you sort of know that guy, but you don't know his full background. You want to know it before you see him fight the contender because you want to know, do you even care if he wins? Should he even be at this point in time? So our idea is to create all of that stuff, and I can tell you from working for the other TOs, it's not even that they don't want to do it, it's that they don't have the budget, or they're way too limited in terms of time, or they're a traveling roadshow and there just aren't extra days within people's calendars. They can't get the players. It's a bit easier when the teams that own the players and work with them are the league. You're not asking anyone's permission, you just ask yourself, yeah, I can have my players, yeah, of course. You bring them in. So I think that's one of the most exciting areas, because obviously that's the kind of content I create right now, but it's quite lo-fi, just me and a video camera, isn't it? So I'm hoping with proper production value, that can be as big a selling point as the games themselves, because in my opinion, it's the entertainment product that'll make money in the long term. The game itself right now, I always say this, when you play a match between the two best teams in the world in Counter-Strike, the viewership and the money made from that viewership doesn't even pay the salaries of the players who turned up to the server. What's funny is a lot of them listening to that right now, that would blow their minds. They actually naively think they're being exploited and everyone's making millions off them because all they're good at is wiggling their hand and shoot people in the head. So they can leave the rest of it to us. We'll figure it all out and make them those millions for that brilliant wiggle they do. And that'll be the way the game goes.
Well, of course, that's something that you've always been a very big advocate of, which is the sense of storylining and everything. That's kind of where the entire historian angle also comes from. A lot of this league seems like it's going to take a lot of money, though, in terms of the budget that you're talking about, how tournament organizers don't necessarily have the budget in the same way, etc. So for a league that's potentially going to have higher overheads for content, and maybe not for things like venues, because from what I understand, it'll be from the same place and whatnot, but you still have to create, and also keeping in mind that it's the league that now teams are seeking to go for profitability with, which is a very big thing to say when you're losing between $1 and $2 million a year. So is monetization still largely going to be through sponsorships, or are we going to see some places where we can now spend money a little bit more? And I'm alluding to things like merchandising, but more specifically to things like pay-per-view.
As far as I know, at the moment, there is no pay-per-view concept on the horizon because it's about getting this current product up to speed. I personally do think that is a vital thing in the future that we've got to have. That's also the reason I think esports should lean more towards WWE and UFC, because these are the people who mastered making the money through pay-per-view and not through the traditional method of going on television like the EPL and then selling the highest sponsorships because you have every eyeball in the world watching, and it doesn't matter if that eyeball's worth less. That's how you make all the money, right? I think the way that they went outside of the mainstream and made their millions and created millions of fans is very, very appealing. And I think at the moment, you've seen that those things can eventually get to the mainstream, but even when they do, it comes their own way. And by going a different route and then basically forcing the mainstream to come to them, they don't sacrifice anything about the way the sports were. It's not like the UFC now is with mittens on and they're only allowed to slap each other, because that's what CBS would want. No, it's the other way around. If you want a Fox deal for the big UFC fights, it's because Fox has realized it's gotten so big on its own that they have to come and buy into that. It's not the other way that we're buying into Fox's vision and changing for them. So I think personally, the pay-per-view is the future. It's just far off for everyone right now at this point in time. I don't think there'll be a way for fans necessarily to pay, aside from if they enjoy the sponsors, obviously they can get involved from that angle. So I do think it's something where Obviously, it's going to cost a lot to be involved in the league, but as you said, the economics right now are that everyone's in a desperate position. Like, even though I certainly don't like the ethics and the professional way that ESL's approached some of the things they've done with their Pro League, I certainly understand the intention behind it and what the impetus is, which is that they're in a burning house right now, and at the moment, they're willing to push someone else out the window if it means they get a little bit more oxygen to breathe before the whole house burns down. Like, they're not really in a great position where they can do a lot right now. So I think if you look, there's a reason why they were trying to sell their entire esports side of the MTG brand to China, basically, because they know with the minimum guarantee they've placed for these players through the CSPPA and the upcoming Pro Tour, I think they were going to lose something like $45 million minimum over the next couple of years. So that's a lot of money to be losing, and that's also an area I feel like where our brand is in a much more stable place, which is we're the teams who are in esports, and we're not going anywhere. So we're building a league that hopefully can last in esports. Whereas if you're MTG, I mean, it's not even the case that whether you want to keep ESL and DreamHack. If they become too much of a financial liability, you're public companies. You actually have what's called a fiduciary responsibility to literally make your shareholders money. They can actually take you to court if you don't do it. So if you get pushed into a desperate position where esports isn't viable, that means selling it or downsizing it. So I feel as though at the moment, this is almost like we're building an escape capsule for Counter-Strike, and it's hopefully going to escape the dumpster fire that is the other franchise leagues, which as far as I can tell, is everyone just bleeding money and seeing it's like a zombie apocalypse. Who's going to be the last one left? You can be the king of all the post-apocalyptic world, but what will there be when everyone else has bled out?
Well, there's obviously certain disadvantages to being a public company that you mentioned as well, in the sense that the sense of responsibility towards shareholders is very different to what you guys are going to be experiencing. But one thing that you've been very key on is transparency within the league. And this is you as an individual, not as the overall league. So within that transparency, we also understand that public companies do have a certain degree of transparency that allows us, as in the fans, to, through Richard Lewis generally, to hold them accountable to some extent. To, at the very least, so if ESL is saying, look at how successful we are, we can say, you just lost 40 million last calendar year. What's going on with that? So are we going to see any sort of level of transparency to compensate for the fact that, Flashpoint is not going to be a public company? So are we going to see things like, for example, how much box office you're making if it comes to that, which is something you've talked about in the past, about esports teams not disclosing financials and non-sponsorship revenues, things like that. Is that going to be something that's kind of expected for the fans?
I don't know for the public. I mean, I would say, bearing in mind it's a league where you buy in for millions of dollars, it's really none of your business out there if you're just a pleb watching the game like me. It's actually none of my business. I'll say that to Carmack at Sarah, because the implication is he's telling me how many people are at the venue, but if they all pay 4 pence, who cares? You don't make any money. So the problem is when you say the numbers and the capacity, people start making references. You've seen it in a million whack mainstream articles to how many watched the NHL playoffs or how many had this UFC fight. Listen, I'll take the worst NHL finals ever over anything ESL or the International or Riot Worlds ever put on, because that makes money. The other ones just lose money. So that's the reason I put that forward. I do think it's important to have elements of transparency. So what I'll say is this: for the teams that are involved in that have bought in, they already beforehand, as part of the pitch, were sent documents which, listen, I'm not a journalist, but if you know what you're doing out there, maybe you could get hold of these documents that show the breakdown of the revenue and show exactly what we take and what the running costs are, and then what they get, and then what their profit share is, and what the minimum guarantee. It has all this stuff laid out there. So nothing's hidden in terms of within the company. I would just say at this point in time, yeah, it's not a public product in that sense. Like, it's not supposed to be the case that they get to know how much we make. At the moment, the key is to make the teams that buy in the money, and then, as I say, the teams that come through the open qualifier, you're welcome to come and win some of the prize money, but you're also just kind of making up part of the party.
DK, that's an invitation to you if I've ever seen one. But the final thing that I kind of had to talk to you about was also that there is something that in Counter-Strike is sorely missing, which to some extent we are seeing from other developers and other esports in particular. So I'm going to reference to the Overwatch League, which is where we do have, or we did have, this idea of a Twitch all-access pass, where you can spend $20 and you can kind of get a lot more content. You can have things that you probably can't provide in terms of in-game items, but there are certain incentives. And that's one of the few instances in esports where the ability to spend money isn't, hey, buy a $60 jersey. It's, hey, get a $10 pass online using something you already use. Are we going to see similar mechanisms in place from Flashpoint?
As far as I know, again, this is not something that's being planned right now. The main thing now is get the sustainable path to monetization. I'm key with that word. Like, I'm not going to promise when the money's going to come. That's up for the business guys to say. My idea is to keep moving one step closer to monetization, because at the moment, no one's really doing it. They're doing it on such a limited level that there's a reason why the big billionaire entrepreneurs, who I know behind the scenes, have had people go and do their due diligence on esports, always come away and say, maybe in 10 years, because when they find out you basically only make money off a logo and there's no ticket sales in terms of what you make, you're the team, you don't make any of that. You don't make any money directly from your fans. Generally, the merchandising is very, very limited compared to a Real Madrid, a Barcelona, any NFL franchise, quite frankly. I think if you look at that aspect, I actually think that's one thing I'll give props to the Overwatch League for. Even though, based on my limited understanding of that deal, it was an incredibly corrupt backroom deal that was using like back channels and just basically politics. I could say these things, mate. It seemed like that anyway. I will just say that the idea of having the in-game item, I do think is the game changer that leagues like that should pursue, because as you said, there isn't, like, because the millions of people who watch the esports game aren't in a real life stadium, wearing the jersey isn't the same thing. I mean, part of why I wear it if I'm a Kansas City Chiefs fan is because I'm in the stadium with all the other fans and I'm signaling to them, hey, we're all fans of this team, I'm cheering for you, look at me, I'm a fan of yours. It's a status symbol, it's belonging to something. That doesn't really work if you're just sat on Twitch or YouTube with all the rest of us. Like, you may as well be in your underpants like most of us usually are, eating Cheetos. So I would say the idea of having the in-game item, whether that's a jersey inside the game or a pennant of the team or something, I do think that's a great approach. It's just at the moment that's not something we're implementing in our particular league. Maybe for the future.
Well, that's about it from us over at GGRecon. Thank you for joining us, and that's been Thorin, the creative director of now Flashpoint. The newly crowned B-Side League has found a name, and it's already had a face for a while, but you're going to be able to see that face more on his own shows, on By the Numbers, on Summoning Insight, lots of things he's doing. Way too much content to really keep up with, but stay tuned for more announcements, especially the calendar year for GG coming out soon on GGRecon.